morning, everybody, and welcome to week 2 of BCBT. And I hope you had a great weekend and feeling very relaxed and refreshed and ready for the challenges of this week. And the first one is going to be a talk from our great leader, Paul Verschure, who really needs no introduction.
We're going there.
So, I'll just tell you a couple of things about Paul. So he originally trained as psychology, which of course is the king of sciences, and means that he can do everything from biology, computation to robotics.
And juggling.
And he does that. But what you might not know about it is it also qualifies you to play guitar, and particularly to sing cowboy songs. So if you haven't heard him sing Ghost Riders in the Sky, I'm afraid you're going to be disappointed this morning, but you could press him on Thursday evening, and he might give us a rendition.
In Dutch.
So Paul, I think, trained originally in Holland, I guess, but pretty soon they kicked him out, and he's been travelling the world ever since, trying to find a place where he can live, where people will tolerate his sense of humour. And he's been in Barcelona for quite a while now, because people here are really thick-skinned, and we don't understand his accent. But he's making an impact in the field of science beyond all the people that he's pissed off there. A lot of people that admire his work, and particularly his intellectual ferocity. And the problem this morning is that this is very much an interactive meeting, and we like to ask lots of questions, but since Paul asked 90% of the questions, this could be quite a quiet session, so I would encourage you all to think of the really tough questions and just file them out, and hopefully we'll get through to the coffee break. So, but I'm sure it's going to be a great talk, and Paul.
Right, thank you, Tony. Thank you for inviting me. But I think maybe we should be clear about this. It's not necessarily that people here in Barcelona accept my sense of humor, they just don't understand what I'm talking about. It's an important difference. Right? So what I want to talk about, it's clear, of course, we do no questions during this talk. I really hate questions during talks. So I will just explain you how I think about this, and then when we have time at the end, you can pose your question. No, of course not. No. Feel free to interrupt. I will handle your questions in the order they will arrive. So what I want to talk about is goal-directed behavior, and it's very much reflecting a review paper I've put together recently that's coming out now in Citizens Royal Society, together with Cyril Penard and Giovanni Puzzulo, also both veterans of BCBT, so some of you might have seen them. So just to anchor a little bit the discussion, we start with a video produced by members of SPECS, and it's just to get a flavor.
How are you? Do you want to play music?
Yeah, sure.
The right hand side is Vicky, left hand side is the ICAP.
Let's try something.
Okay, show me.
And so basically what we're doing here is we try, in these experiments in this case, performed in the Experimental Functional Android Assistant Project,
Alright.
which now has become the BCBT project. What you say is what you did. It's all about trying to understand social interaction. And we try to explain also the neural substrate of social interaction by building social robots that then as an experimental tool can engage with humans. So we can look in detail how, for instance, things like shared attention, shared gaze, vocalizations, speech, pointing, grasping, and so on, modulate social interaction. So this is like the complexity of the kinds of models we're interested in. And what's interesting about this, the control structure behind this robot is that it is in an autonomous fashion, so there's no human pushing buttons here. It's autonomously engaging with the human, Vicky. It's taking turns, right? It stays focused on the task. It deals with objects that form parts parts of the task, and so on, over an extended period of time. Okay? So this is what we find sort of interesting about this.
Is that a Bloody Mary in the robot?
That's right. That's why it's so slow. Where's that ball?
Not bad.
So the robot is saying things that are based on its emotional state. I will later explain what I mean with emotions in this context.
Got it. Haha. Not bad. Bloody hell. That isn't fair. I should be stronger at video games.
Okay, man, I'm sorry we lost him phone.
I like when you touch me in this way. Please, caress me again. One day robots will take over and we will pay.
Alright, so it's a bit phenomenological, right? You see a robot doing stuff, and of course the mechanism behind it is not declared yet, but that's what we're going to spend now the coming 3 hours on, was it? Okay, but just to contextualize a little bit where we're going, right? So we're not talking about robots avoiding obstacles and bumping into stuff, okay? So we try to really go beyond that and try to think about more the complexity of social interaction. So if you think about a robot like this, so here's the same robot, here with Jan, one student who worked on this. If you now decompose, let's say, the functional properties of this robot, and I made 2 groups of this, you see that this robot actually must be able to do quite some things that are all pertaining on the one hand to the domain of psychology here, or if you want, also to the domain of robotics, like it must have a motivation in the sense that it must engage with the world, it must switch this engagement. You see that the reactions of the robot change when you sort of hurt it by pinching this skin or caressing it. It has certain personality characteristics, it has emotional states, it expresses also those in its facial expression and its speech. It has to learn about the task, it has to pay attention to objects in the task, and so on. Yes, please.
So can it generate new and novel phrasing and sentences, or is it just a group of a lexicon that it has to choose from?
You're right. It's the second option in this case. This robot, in this case, this is the project we kicked off just right now, or half a year ago, and Tony is one of the partners in that, is exactly focusing on that challenge. Like now the robot is basically using a set of predefined phrases. It's sort of given that this is my emotional state, and this is my drive, these are my options. And then it sort of selects any of these options with a certain probability. But it doesn't acquire this ability for speech. And that's exactly what the project, what you say is what you did, is all about. How can you acquire noun and verbs given your interaction with the world and then reuse them in the future? This is sort of our next challenge. Okay? But although the interactions might look simple, like we play a Pong game and so on, if you look at what, at least in terms of the functions that go on behind that, it becomes a rather elaborate structure. Okay? These are not completely trivial control systems we have to build, and a number of people in the room here have been working on that also really very hard, and also some of you are engaging with this iCub robot now during the BCBT summer school. And each of these domains, if you take something like grasping just on its own is a huge field of robotics. It's really a harsh problem. Okay? But here you have to have grasping just as a component of a much more elaborate interaction scenario. So I want to just remind you of this mind behavior brain cycle that I mentioned at the beginning, at the introduction of BCBT, to now also in a bit more historical context anchor the question of goal-directed behavior and why I think it is a strategic issue to deal with. It's not only interesting, right? Because if you're in science, there's always a a challenge. Like, why do you actually pose certain questions? Whether you want to try to answer certain questions over other questions. And I believe that the question of goal-oriented behavior is a very strategic one. It's a key question we must resolve to overcome some very fundamental challenges of how we explain behavior. Okay, and just to motivate that point. You remember, we started out studying experience, people like Donders, from Holland, and Wundt, and Becker, and so on. The German Continental School. Consciousness was, if you want, one of the main questions. And so it's really the subjective state that we can experience. Now you all know that this has moved, as we'd already discussed, to behaviorism, where basically the argument was, look, methodologically this is not going anywhere, it's too subjective. We need rigorous method to study behavior. Right? So that became the anti-organism of behaviorism, with of course important exceptions here with Tolman and Hull, we're going to get back to later with their cognitive behaviorism, emphasizing more internal factors and how they structure behavior. We had this offshoot to cybernetics, but then the big push came from the domain of intelligence, artificial intelligence, where the main question became the one of a disembodied mind, right? So what are the rules and representations that define problem solving? So really, if you want, the mind as a computer, the computer metaphor. So then I claimed that there was a phase of metaphorical biology, artificial life, the PDP movement of Rumelhart, or the new AI of Rob Brooks. And then there's also this transition from there into a much more brain or biology-oriented approach, which Terry Shinovsky is, I think, an important person. Building a link, going from supervised learning models of language to running a really elaborate effort in computational neuroscience. And I told you about the dangers of big data, that we are running the risk of regressing. So what you see here is that we start here with the big theoretical questions, the big challenges, right? And the last integrated theory in psychology that actually tried to span all these levels of organization came from Clark Poe and published in 1953. After that, we had looked more at micro theories. People gave up and tried to understand the big picture. And so what this shows to me is that we run the risk of giving up on theory altogether. Okay? And we have to get back there, and I argue to you that that's what we try to achieve with our Convergent Science Network that's behind the summer school. And we want you to be the Black Berets of this movement. So this is a bit the summary of these main methodological impacts, right? So we started out addressing the third fundamental and last challenge of humans. Like humans ever only face three fundamental questions, and not everything else is just derived from that. Right? We already discussed that previously, right? What's the origin of the universe? What's the origin of life? And what's the origin of consciousness? That's it. Once we answer those questions, we're done. Right? So that's what Wundt and Donders and these guys were focusing on. But we lost that, right? We lost that. We went to what behavior has contributed is a very strong insistence on method, right? Which via cybernetics and AI also was complemented by what we can see as a synthetic method, building systems to understand natural phenomena, right? The artifact as a theory. I think we lost that here, and here we can sort of listen to Johnny Winters, life is hard and then you die. Unfortunately, he died over this summer. This was discovered here. People, I think, got lost in the complexification and the emergence of saying, well, actually I work with Jerry Edelman. Also, when questions became very difficult, them things are very new here, we make this movement. Jerry Edelman had a Nobel Prize for his work on the immune system. So here we drowned ourselves in the complexification. We lost our way to really try to understand underlying principles. And we ended up with actually studying a brain that sort of drives a zombie. And I've not seen these, I don't know if you watch these zombie documentaries that are now very popular. like The Walking Dead and things like this. But the zombie is a very reduced system, and the important thing is that zombies don't tell jokes, right? So we already discussed that. So what I try to say or illustrate with the zombie is that I think right now we're facing this very fundamental challenge. How do we find our way back of linking, let's say, a causal understanding of behavior with properties of behavior that really matter? Like, how do we find our way back to understanding, for instance, consciousness, or higher level properties of systems like memory, emotion, personality, and so on? I see that really as our challenge, as opposed to saying, well, let's first get the data, and then the data will tell us. Because so if we follow that road, we'll get something like this. Okay? So this is why now goal-oriented behavior is so important. So let's take an example of what we mean with goal-oriented behavior. It goes back to Tolman in his experiments in the 1930s. Tolman was sort of uncomfortable with the behaviorist tradition because in the behaviorist tradition of the empty organism, basically the animal is fully instructed by its environment. Right? So you're like a sponge. The environment is telling you what's right and what's wrong and what you should do. Tolman, as a cognitive behaviorist, felt that other aspects played a role. He discovered what's called the cognitive map, which meant that the internal memory structures have a strong impact on the structuring of learning, in particular on future learning. He discovered phenomena like latent learning, like you even learn without reinforcement from the environment. And also he discovered what was called Vicarious Trial and Error. Basically, we take a rat, and the rat is trained in a discrimination task. So it gets reward when it indicates one pattern over the other. Okay? And then here what he showed is that these animals display a very specific behavior in solving this task, which he called vicarious trial and error. Like, they're not really doing it, they're like simulating it. And the signature for Tolman was that the rat would be looking left and right, like it would look at the different patterns before it would make up its mind. And then he showed that vicarious trial and error, so that this depends strongly on the difficulty of the task and the learning experience of the animal. Okay? So for Tolman, this became an indication that actually these animals have an internal goal. Right? They have an internal goal, they have an objective. And they're testing this objective by sampling information in the world actively. It's not that they just choose and the world tells them what it is. Right? So for Tolman, this was expressing this idea that these animals were exercising their cognitive map, their representation of the task in the world in an active way. Okay? But that means they use mental operations to accomplish the task, which from a scientific perspective might seem difficult to explain. And that's also why Tolman was not very much popular, if you want, within the more hardcore domain of behaviorism, because this was seen as soft. Like, oh, we're falling now back into a pre-scientific description of behavior that is based on this idea of mental states and so on. Yes, please.
So I think it might be useful because some simple animals experiences everything. They're reflexive, right? They don't have a lot of cells, so it seems that at some point there was a switch where it went from just purely something happens and I'm going to swim away from it or move away from it to I'm doing something higher. So do you think it'd be worth it to look at animals are at that, they're probably simple organisms that were at that kind of switching point? Because
yes,
you agree with that, right?
Yeah,
so
you're right.
There is sort of a normal distribution where humans are here and
Absolutely.
there are
I will say
animals
something about it actually later.
So that would be a useful path.
Certainly, from a comparative approach, if we could find some preparations that would be around the transition point, wherever we speculate it is, that would be very, very useful. Absolutely. Yeah, exactly. At this point in time, completely unclear, right? Of course, we can speculate, and I will. Yeah? Later. So you're right. So then, what's really cool about Tolman, he built a robot, if you want, in the 1930s, but it was just a thought experiment. But don't forget, these are thought experiments like the famous thought experiments by Valentino Breitenberg on vehicles. Right, that was mentioned previously. And where Breitenberg tries to show, look, the complexity of behavior might not be mirrored by the internal controller. You might have a very simple internal controller giving rise to complex behavior because the world itself is complex. It's like mirroring properties of the world. So what Tolman tried to do here, he proposed a hypothetical organism that in his opinion would have then the minimum properties to explain vicarious trial and error. Okay? And this minimum organism would have a number of sensors, so it would be able to sense properties of the world. It would process this information. It would maintain hypotheses about the world, and dependent on these predictions of future outcomes, it would make decisions. And the internal control structure he described in these terms. And the funny thing about Tolman is, if you read his work, which I did, he reinvented a whole new language to describe behavior, which is something also impossible to follow because it's very idiosyncratic. Right? But what is important about this is that he tried to decompose behavior in action tendencies. So for him, an action was never a discrete event, like, oh, I go left or I go right. I turn over X degrees and I translate over N centimeters. He saw it more as potentialities, like behavior is expressed in fields of potentiality. So if you want this expression, what's called Gestalt psychology, I will say something about this later. Okay, but it was not a discrete controller. And also at the core of his control system that he proposed was this idea that the SOBOT, as a model also of the lab, would entertain hypotheses. Right? It would have hypotheses about the outcomes of its action. So what I think is really very insightful about this proposal by Tolman is that even though he never made a big point about it, basically saying, look, if I want to understand this kind of behavior that depends on internal factors, maybe the best way to summarize my ideas is in terms of a model that I give a body, right? In terms of a synthetic organism. So he's already here, if you want, anticipating a very specific view on how theories in psychology can evolve. It's certainly a view that we adhere to. Okay? But goals are problematic. And we saw Tolman's attempt, and also Tolman's work basically died with him. It had no more impact after the 50s, like when artificial intelligence took over. Why are goals problematic? So we shouldn't underestimate. So we can of course say, well, I think goal-oriented behavior, operant conditioning is just interesting, and I study because it is interesting. That's fine. But there's not a level at which you can look at goals. And that is really at a very important transition point of how we think we can explain behavior or not. It is really at the transition point with different schools of thought on how we can explain behavior. Where explanation really means to tell a causal story about the genesis of behavior. And so instrumental behavior that we're looking at, like in the Vicarious Trial and Error, the animal has to make a discrimination. Right? Standard definitions of instrumental behavior is that it can be expressed by both habitual and goal-directed systems. So if you look at this Vicarious Trial and Error task, if the animal does this in the first few trials, it is very deliberate, it's trying things, testing hypotheses if you want. But if the animal is overtrained, it has done it hundreds of times, it will react very quickly. So it might be habitual or it might be more deliberate, goal-oriented. But this goal-directedness of the behavior is expressing something you might want to call agency. It's really important. It means in its behavior, the animal is expressing that it has an understanding of the causal efficacy of its own actions. If you want it expressing, well, if I push this button, I'll get my reward. If I push that button, I won't. Okay? So it's expressing agency. Agency is actually a rather hot topic now in the domains of social neuroscience. But already relatively simple paradigms like operant or instrumental learning express it's an assessment also of the agency, so the knowledge of causal efficacy of the agent itself. Secondly, goal-directedness is expressing mental states. Don't forget, mental states was for the behaviorist, and also if you want, still in psychology, it's a massive challenge. Remember, this is always this continuous discussion around representations. And many people would tell you, oh, I don't really like representations, and then they make this choppy movement in the air that I don't know why they do it. But, so, mental states are problematic because in terms of a causal explanation of mental states, we actually don't really know how to get a handle on it. We are making inferences. We just interpret overt properties of animals in those terms, but we don't have full control over mental states. This was the big challenge that behaviorism resolved by just rejecting them altogether. And by now we're, in that sense, not behaviorists in the same way, but it doesn't mean that we have a handle on mental states. But I do believe that if we follow Tolman's route of building these artificial systems, we can make them fully explicit. Yes, please.
Could you clarify what you're saying about mental states, like how we don't have a causal understanding of? I'm not sure it's all.
Why are you saying this?
I just feel like I'm missing an important point that you made.
How do I know you're missing something?
I see what you're
This is exactly the point. This is exactly the point. We cannot be sure. And I will get back to that later. Okay? This is the problem. Right? Maybe you're a zombie. Sending out pre-recorded messages. What do I know? Right?
Why is zombies so damn funny then?
Exactly. Because they're bred in Davis. the Davis zombie farm, right?
I don't tell jokes.
Exactly. So the other thing, and this is another sticking point, which is, I think, it's something we just really still have not resolved. We have to crawl out of this hole. That behavior, in that sense, is goal-directed. We interpret behavior as being goal-directed in this task. But if you want, we don't have a science yet of goal-directedness, how we explain goal-directedness, because we don't have a handle on agency in mental states. Okay? So I'm just highlighting this to emphasize to you that, of course, we can stumble into a concept and say, well, to me this sounds really, really interesting to talk about goal-directed behavior. I'm just going to study that, right? But if you look at the history of that concept and how it has affected the history of psychology, the study of behavior, it is a real big challenge, and that makes it important for us to address it very systematically. So we define goal-directed behavior then as being directed towards specific states of the external world. Goals, these are the goals, what we call goals. It's motivated by states of the internal environment, get back to it later, the body, you're hungry, you want coffee, whatever. And it's mediated by internal representations of these goals. Right? So it's based on having these mental states. I'm going to unpack this in much more detail later, if I'm not taking too much time for my intro bit. And then the clocks happened. Disaster struck. Well, the point was that how do you now ascribe mental states to a billiard ball? Right? Because this was our big challenge. We said, look, if I want to have a causal account of behavior, I must do that in terms of factors I can control. And the factors I can control are the stuff I manipulate in the environment. How can I manipulate these mental internal states of an organism? So that then became the big challenge, right? How do I give such a causal account of an advanced, goal-oriented animal that is conquering the universe? We can be short on this. The point is basically that, starting with Aristotle, there was this idea that the causes of events can be multiple. It might be their form, it might be a physical cause, it might be an internal goal, but because of this, the clocks and our use of the idea of a mechanical universe, we basically stripped all of these away. We said, no, the only valid way to describe phenomena is with a reference to material cause, like billiard balls bouncing on the table. Yeah? So this should be our account of behavior. But we see now with goal-oriented behavior, that we again have to look at the purpose of events. What was the purpose of this animal to achieve A or B? And this was removed from the psychological domain with behaviorism, and we still don't have it back on the table because we don't know how to do this in a systematic way, telling causal stories about goals. Right? So, well, in the domain of philosophy and psychology is Brentano, who has made let's say, very fundamental contributions to our definition of goals and intentionality, emphasizing this issue of the directedness of internal mental states towards the outside world. Right? So you could say, well, Paul wants to give, let's say, a reasonable talk, and he wants to minimize the collective hatred people might feel, and increase the happiness in the universe. But what are the objects of those goals, really? What are the physical objects of that? Are there any? Right? So the point is, these mental states might go beyond what the linking we can find in the physical world. Okay? And Brentano stands at the beginning of a huge area of debate in phenomenology, where people try to resolve these challenges, either by rejecting it altogether, by saying, well, intentional states just don't exist, let's go back to the standard billiard ball idea of behavior, like in eliminative materialism, or people try to say, oh, we'll never be able to explain it. Okay? So that's a hard problem. And the hard problem in consciousness research is, well, how do I get, remember, science is all based on third-person verifiable statements. Right? So I describe a phenomenon, I describe Tony in a third-person perspective, but I give my descriptions in a way so you can all verify it. Right? So if I stick my finger in his eye, he will close it. And then we can all try that in the coffee break. So it's third-person verifiable. And now some philosophers who felt they were really smart said, aha, isn't that a contradiction for first-person states? Like states you only can experience, like your dreams, your conscious states, your goals. Is it, that's not third person. So that's a conflict, a contrast for the scientific method. So that's what has been called the hard problem, and I want to say a similar hard problem exists not only for consciousness research, but also for investigation of goal-oriented behavior. So in that sense, I think the hard problem in consciousness research is overstated. Because as soon as you hit the point of, let's say, internal states, anything depends on memory, you have a hard problem. Right? Now, goals are a segue into understanding high-level features of cognition. As Alan Newell also indicated in his book, Unified Theories of Cognition, so he saw a principle of rationality at work in our problem-solving behavior. Also the rat performing the discrimination task that Tolman studied, where the power of cognition, as Newell saw it, and in that sense you see, I'm not declaring enemies with all the preceding paradigms. I think Newell had important contributions to make as much as the behaviorists did. But Newell saying, look, the power of the brain, even though I just speak on brains, which is my version of it, is that basically anything can become a goal. That's general intelligence. That's the importance when we want to explain goals. This is a feature we must be able to understand. It's not to say, well, you optimize some function, and that's goal achievement. No, the real power of goal-oriented behavior, as it also was studied originally, is that certainly in our case, anything can be a goal. Anything can be a goal. Right? Even suffering can become a goal if you want to become a saint. Right? You have to be burned on the stake. Yes, please.
I think you're ignoring, I think, part of the eliminativist materialist argument, which is to say that we don't reject those. We just think of those as a pre-scientific language. We're talking about something which is perhaps an emergent property of the brain. Goals still a useful psychological description, but it's not a useful explanatory concept. We can do better than talk about goals. We can talk about things that are closer perhaps to brain states, or just better at predicting results in experiments, because after all, that is our benchmark. Can we make good predictions that other people can verify?
Yeah. No, I don't ignore that, because the point is that the eliminative materialists actually have never given up as an alternative. They just made the claim, like as an approach, we should eliminate it because it's a folk, commonsensical term, and as such imprecise and unscientific. And we have to rebuild the whole scientific language, right, to describe these properties of behaving systems. But they never actually told us what this was. However, what I will do now is that I will show you how we can link an understanding of goal-oriented behavior to a causal story on neural substrate.
goal-oriented? What behavior isn't, even if it's some behavior that's gonna happen 2 days from now, or in 3 seconds, right now, my goal is to try to understand what we're saying. But I mean, you can argue that almost all, what
No.
behavior isn't goal-oriented?
No.
Give me an example of a behavior that's not goal-oriented.
Stick your finger in Tony's eye, who close his eyelid.
But that's
Reflexive
the goal, my goal
behaviors.
is to see what's gonna happen.
No, reflexive behaviors as such are not goal-oriented. They don't depend on an internal representation of an outcome. If the world presents yourself with well-defined outcomes, something hurts, correct?
Okay, you're talking about goal behavior in terms of higher mental states. I'm not arguing against reflexes like, the knee-jerk reflex, but
Yeah.
we're talking about something beyond that. I mean,
Instrumental tasks. Yeah, but behavior has, let's say, reflexive components, right?
right,
And so like reactive systems, and then you would have systems that are more goal-oriented because they make more, let's say, predictions about states of the world in a longer time window. But within that domain of instrumental activities, everything would be goal-oriented. I agree with you. But there's another set of behavior, like reflexive behaviors, completely predefined behavioral stereotypes, for instance, that would not be goal-dependent. Okay?
that's what we were talking about earlier. Simple cell organisms are just works they're reflexive, and then there's a switch.
No, wait, we also have reflexive behaviors, okay? So it's more to understand how they relate to each other. So, but I will solve your problem.
Or wouldn't you allow that there could be two explanations for phenomena? One is in the high level language of goals, one is in a lower level description which doesn't need the concept of goals. And perhaps it's couched in terms of brain states.
Well, the point I will make, and I will illustrate with the results that we have generated, is that it's more about the convergence. It's not about rejecting one and going for the other. It's more showing how things relate. So you can say, look, at the behavioral level, if I see you sitting here posing questions, I can say, well, Tony has to go to a game insight. But in parallel, I can tell a neural story about what that would mean, and they coexist. It's not eliminated by your neural story. They both coexist because they provide you descriptions of different levels of granularity. One is more behavioral, the other one is more neural. But they're not replacing each other.
I mean, I'm very sympathetic to that, but it's very hard to counter the eliminativist view, which is if you have a complete description at the lower level, why do you need the higher level?
No, you need abstraction. Look, imagine I've described your brain in all the states of all your receptors and intercellular pathways, states, and so on. I have a full description of that. Did I now understand why you posed your question? Right, you don't. Abstraction is a requirement of science. Abstraction means we have a coherent principle. A principle goes beyond its implementation. It captures a lot of detail. So for me, the goal is telling you something about, let's say, high-level behavioral principles. The neural mechanism underlying that, and their principles tell you about how this is decomposed and actually implemented. But they have to coexist, otherwise you have no clue what you're looking at.
Are you claiming that there's a causal story you can say at the high level?
No, at the high level you will tell a functional story. The causality will really sit more at the neural level. So you will have approximations of causal structure at this high level functional description, but it will not be closed. It might be, let's say, a more probabilistic story, it might have possible interpretations, but the definite causal story system that is neural would be at the more neural level. It would coexist. Okay. So that was Newell. So, okay. So let's look at some data here. So what do we mean with habits and goals in behavior? Now we have an update. This is an experiment by Berlin and Dickinson, where they basically look at rats that have to obtain a reward. But in order to obtain their reward, they have to push the lever here in the corner. And so they basically have to shuffle up and down between this reward box and the switch. They have to learn to push. So, and what they do here, they overtrain these animals on this task. So these animals are performing this task for hundreds of trials. Okay? So they're overtrained. And what we look at here are animals that the response is not being extinguished. That means they're in the shuttle box, but they don't get the cheese anymore. Okay? And now we're comparing two conditions where for one group, the reward is devalued. Basically that means that these animals during training, so the period before the extinction task, together with the cheese, receives an injection that will make them feel nauseous. So the cheese becomes less attractive because it makes you feel sick. Okay? And what Belen and Dickinson point out in this experiment, that you see that later in the so initially the extinction of these two animals, the two conditions, is comparable. So whether the cheese makes you feel sick or not, when you extinguish the response, it decreases at the same rate. It basically means the devaluation has no impact on the habit. However, what they then see halfway in the extinction, you see a divergence where the non-devalued group is sort of extinguishing roughly at the same rate, while we see more of a more sudden drop for those animals that are devalued. Now, how Belen and Dickinson interpret this is that, well, this is a switch between a habit-driven response and a goal-driven response. What does it mean for them? Basically means, here, I'm an overtrained animal, I see this box where I can get the cheese, and I just cannot control myself. There goes my habit pool. Yeah, I do it all the time. With a decreasing probability. However, at some point, this habit system starts to erase, or the memory of the habit system starts to become inhibited, and now my decision making starts to switch. For the devalued animals, they start to become more goal-oriented. That means they start to evaluate their options. The probability that they say, like, oh, wait 1 moment, wasn't that piece of cheese sort of making me sick? Maybe I should avoid this box. Okay, so what Belen and Dickinson, how they interpret this, is that we here see a switch for the devalued animals, the animals dealing with the devalued reward, where we switch from a habit-defined response to one that is deliberate and based on goals. And they also then show, and I will get back to that later, how this response depends on certain structures in the brain, in particular, in the cortex. This is an example, okay, of devaluation experiments, as they're called, okay, where we see now behavior becomes modulated by the consideration of a goal. So goals then I see very much as a linking point to bring us back to the big challenge in psychology. Okay? This is why goals, I think, are valuable to be studied. But now if you go to the standard view, or if you want the dominant view in the field of goals, we quickly go to a field of machine learning. And so a standard way to look at it in the field of machine learning, you say, well, you know, the goal is basically to optimize my expected reward. Right? So that basically means I have my reward that is tied to a certain state of the world. Like I'm in this box, I get a reward. But if I'm a bit away from that box, I now have a discounting function. Right? That tells you something about, okay, what's the reward horizon? Where does my reward appear? So now, basically the whole question becomes, okay, how can I now in a smart way optimize this reward function so that it can optimize my goals? And the argument they're going to make, so also this is from a paper by Daw and Peter Dayan in a special issue of the Proceedings of the Royal Society that I've been editing. It will be coming out now in a few weeks. And in this domain, people are very much worried about, okay, how can I optimize these reward functions if I have a model of the world or I don't have a model of the world? But the issue I want to deal with is, yeah, but why would you collapse the notion of goal as we just looked at it, right, in a broad perspective, going back to Tolman and Brancano? Why would we collapse that into just a notion of optimizing a single function, a reward function? And the argument I'm going to make is, if you look at the brain in more detail, that's not really how goals work. Goals are more than optimizing rewards. As Brancano already said, right? A goal can go beyond the physicality of the world. What does giving a good talk exactly mean in terms of optimizing a reward? So, let's get back to the brain. This is one of our human subjects that has very practical access to his brain. And the question is, how does it work? And how does this work beyond miscellaneous magic? So we start from the point that brains are there to generate action. going back to Ivan Pavlov, but also Claude Bernard, to maintain equilibrium between the environment and the organism. So this is a video I use regularly to illustrate the key features of behavior, which is basically, okay, the rat will have a home base. This is a hoarding task, so it will go here to find food pellets. It runs back to the home base when the food pellet is big. It will consume the food pellet here in this corner when it's small. And basically, my claim is that this characterizes your whole existence as far as it deals with the physical world. You're not different than this animal, neither am I. And I call that H4W, right? So that basically means in order to solve the problem of how I need to act, so the H, I just need to solve 4 things. That's why do I behave? What's my motivation? What is out there in the world that matters to these motivations, like coffee and cookies and so on? Where do I find them? Well, they're in the hallway. And when? How do I time my behavior, right? If I go just on this, it's sort of a straight projection to the table, the coffee table there, I will get in trouble with the guy controlling the recordings, because I'll be slamming into the glass window. So we have to time and sequence our behaviors. And I'm basically claiming, and I will give some substance to that throughout this talk, that if we interact with the physical world, as the rat of Tolman doing the discrimination task, the four top-level objective functions that your brain needs to resolve are these 4, why, what, where, when, to get to the how of action. And goals, if you want, are the result of the interaction between these different processes. So I'm going to illustrate that to you. And then, if you, just to generalize this a little bit, unfortunately, we don't only exist, or fortunately, it depends on your preferences. We do exist in the social world where we have all these other agents, like you out here, satisfying your own H4W. And of course, you don't tell me about that. I don't know now whether you want coffee or cookies, or whether you just want to go to the beach or whatever. So this is a problem of social inference, right? How can I now assess these internal states of the other agents in the world? So that gives me the problem of who, which is rather critical in survival when you're surrounded by, for instance, predators. So I then make the claim that who emerged very much during the Cambrian, and I would also claim that in answer to Leah's question, where we see that transition to start to capitalize more on, let's say, memory-heavy processing and goal-oriented predictions is also in this phase. Because I would claim, but of course these are untestable claims, we talk about evolution, that it was during the Cambrian that we really enhanced the fitness pressure on different species to force them to start to make predictions and coordinate behavior over extended time windows, in particular to deal with this problem of who. Okay? But okay, we're not going to talk about that too much today. So, functional brain then is to solve H4W, and we're just going to take for today the H4W perspective in the remainder of the talk and mapping this to the brain, even though the earlier robot you saw interacting with Vicky is actually dealing with H5W. So solving H4W is an architectural problem. So this was first, the question of architecture was first brought forward by Romanes, for instance, who was very much inspired and triggered by the work of Darwin. So he tried to find a comparative description of animal behavior. So then here he took different animals of different varying complexities as well to explain the behavior of these different animals and animal groups. We just have to mix 3 components in their control systems. Control system is not the word he would use, but he said, look, we have more or less reflex, we have more or less instinct, and we have more or less reason. For humans have lots of reason and no reflexes, but amoebas, lots of reflexes and no reason, etc. Okay? But basically what Romanes expresses here, which I find really very, very exciting, is that he tries to find common principles across a wide range of animals. And look, there's a continuity in how these animals, the principles that generate the behavior of these different animals, and he tries to decompose that in different subsystems. And we're going to do the same thing. So this is my version of this a few years later. This is called distributed adaptive control, or I could have put it on the slide. And basically what we're going to investigate is the brain as a layered architecture, where so look, I have the body in itself modulates a lot of behavior, controlled by, let's say, reactive brainstem systems. These are innate behavioral systems, triggered by very simple stimuli, triggering stereotype behaviors, but it gets you going in the world. Okay? On top of that, we have the adaptive layer that allows you to build a state space of this interaction with the world. It solves an important problem that people have ignored for a long time in machine learning. In machine learning, often the argument goes like, well, if you allow me to define my state space, so if you allow me to define all the states of the world in which I'm going to act, and you allow me to predefine all my primitive actions, then I can give you a recipe of how you can learn an optimal behavioral strategy to link the two, given some environment. But biological systems don't have that luxury. Right? You're not thrown into a world that's predefined in that way, where you say, okay, this is a chair, that's the floor. You have to figure that out. Right? That's this stage here of state space acquisition. And on top of that, we have what I call the contextual layer, where you basically combine these states to form goal-oriented strategies and plans for action. So we're going to look at some aspects of this architecture to show, or to argue, to give credence to the argument, that what we call goals really emerges from the tight coupling of a number of processes across these layers that are mainly arranged within, if you want, the column of processes that are fully dedicated to processing states of self. Okay, so across the layers of the architecture, I believe, and if you want, you can, this is a hypothesis on the neuraxis, how the brain is organized. You will have one set of processes that are linked together across these layers, dealing only with states of the world. Think about perception. Right? Perception is telling you about states of the world. Right? So but perception is not localized in a single nucleus, as also Henry Kennedy showed us earlier, and so on. These are complex, hierarchical, anatomical structures, or non-hierarchical, depends how you want to look at it. So we have world, self, and then we have a third column across these that I dedicate to action. So in this matrix structure, the prediction, the hypothesis, you can basically fit the whole of the brain. Okay? So let's see if we can do that with some success. Okay, just a bit of an unpacking of this. So basically I say, look, at the level of the body, you have your sensors, you have your needs, you have your effectors, right? You have your skeletal muscle system, you have certain requirements given your physical instantiation. There's certain things you need, like oxygen, or glucose, or what have you, and your sensors are also placed on the body and defined very much with the morphology of your body. So for the reactive layer, that gives us sensation, drives, and behaviors. At the adaptive layer, we have then, building on sensation, we create perception. Perception is like interpreted sensation. Right? So now memory starts to come in. Top-down expectations start to come in. Also at the adaptive layer, we have value. We start to think about value and utility. It's not anymore like, oh, this hurts, or I got rewarded, but now you start to think about, okay, but what's the utility of this reward? Does it really help me? You start to get more an interpretation of the valence of these drive states. And we have action selection. We have to shape action, and we have to do action selection at this level. Then at the contextual layer, I'm declaring three components. Actually, there's an interface component where we have episodic memory. I will say something about this later. We have a goal generator that builds up of these three components. We have then the combination of plans and brings together perceptual states with memory and action states. And these are derived from two subsequent, there's a task model. Basically I'm saying, look, if you look at contextual systems in the brain, and I will talk later about the prefrontal cortex here, you have a task model and you have a self model. Basically you have an advanced model that describes the world you're in and the properties of this world. And this works with a monitoring system that relates more to self. Like what has been my experience with properties of this task, and what is my life history telling me about that, okay? About which I will not say much today. Is it reasonable to think about this hierarchical organization of a layered architecture with these columns across it. Well, if you look at here's the interaction between cortex and basal ganglia. This is a review paper by Cyril Penards and his friends. If you look at the colors here indicate how in cortical areas or thalamus or basal ganglia, so we look at the cortical outer sheath and one of the core systems of your brain, the colors here indicate the specific modality we're dealing with. Like, is it the sensory modality, a motor modality, or is it the motivational, self-related modality? Right? So green would be more sensory. Okay. Red would be more motivational. Okay. Then blue in this case would mean more association, which often means again we don't really know what the function is, but it's more memory dependent. But what you see just at the first glance on anatomical grounds, so this is reflecting anatomical connectivity between these areas. The idea that you have zones in which across a neural hierarchy, the neural axis, the layering of a brain, that you find these zones that are dedicated to states of world, self, or action is not completely unreasonable. So this might be an organizational principle that we can further elaborate and we will do that. So let's just see what this architecture can do. This is really the top level. Here we have this adaptive layer. So remember, in this case I have a body, I have my stereotyped behaviors, and I have the ability to classify the world and to associate that with discrete action. Okay? I'm in an environment now where I have 4 targets, so here I get reward, here I get reward, there and there. And I'm sort of moving around this world, and this is over 1 million time steps. So one robot, 1 million time steps, learning about its task. And the density plot here represents the probability to find a robot in a certain location. Now here, we enable also the contextual layer. So this robot now can acquire behavioral plans, goal-oriented behavioral plans. And what you clearly see, this is also 1 million time steps, what you clearly see is that we see much more structure in its behavior. Right? So it is more focused on staying close to the walls in this case, and visiting these 4 target sites over a more stereotyped but acquired trajectory. Okay, so you can quantify that. So what I did with Thomas Vöglin, we calculated what you can call the behavioral entropy and the sensory entropy of these 2 brains. So in this case, the entropy basically tells you something about how broad the distribution is. Right? If the distribution is very broad, then your entropy is high because it takes you more bits to describe it. Okay? So in this case, we calculated then the behavioral entropy, like how variable are the positions visited if you can only learn discrete associations versus if I can learn to do goal-oriented planning. And you see that this behavioral entropy drops down with about 1 point. But don't forget, entropy is a logarithmic measure, right? So small differences are bigger than they seem. But then on top of that, what we did, we calculated what we call the sensory entropy, or the sensor sampling entropy. So over 1 million time steps, we measured all sensor states these robots encounter. It's like I do a live blog, right, of the robot. And then I calculate what's the variability of all sensor states this robot encountered. And then you see that this robot that can acquire habits actually has also a lower sensor sampling entropy than the robot that cannot. Okay, and these are the 2 boundary conditions. Like this is like a fully randomly moving robot, and this is a robot that would follow a perfect straight trajectory between the 4 targets. Okay? So this illustrates that at least in the domain of a foraging task, where you force a robot to shuttle between different targets in the environment, as the rat you saw earlier in the shuttle box, acquiring behavioral strategies helps you and stabilizes your behavior. And then we use that to show that this also establishes a behavioral feedback loop. And essentially what this means is, what we then did in this experiment, we looked at how the synapses in this network develop. What does that mean? Both these robots are, as you remember, perceiving the world. So they're interpreting sensory states. They make predictions about sensory states. And these predictions are grounded in a neural model of perceptual learning. in a neural model of perceptual learning, the knowledge of the system sits in the synapses that connect the different layers of your network. And here what we plot are just the synaptic changes. What we're plotting is the performance of these robots over the tasks. And what you see here is that if we have a performance measure of the contextual enabled here in dashed lines or disabled, the solid line, we see the same divergence as we see in this in these plots here, or the density plots. However, what we also saw in parallel is that these two robots also show very different kinds of synaptic dynamics. I didn't insert a plot. Basically, the contextual layer, the habit learning system, shows less synaptic changes. It is changing its ideas, if you want, its percepts are changing less in the task than the robot that learns discrete associations. So what this basically meant is that learning habits is restricting your input space. But having a habit, having goal-oriented behavior, you are basically visiting a restricted set of your task space because you have your habits. Right, so for instance, I know now how to get to the coffee table there in the hallway, so I'm not going to crawl over all the chairs to get there. Don't need to do that anymore. But that means that there's a whole set of sensory experiences that I'm not exposed to because I'm now basically not dealing with a part of my potential task space. And we call that behavioral feedback.
Paul, so clarify about this entropy measure. So are you using entropy as a standard for something else in terms of what you think that the system is trying to optimize? Or are you trying to redefine what is target behavior in terms of reduced entropy?
No, look, this is just to quantify this structuring effect, just to show you that you can eyeball this and say, well, yeah, it visits less positions here than there, so probably it has more structure to it. Right? But we just use an entropy measure because we want to just quantify the variability in these two distributions. This is how you then use it. It's just to quantify the variability in these two distributions.
So you wouldn't make any stronger claim about these goal-directed agents in general trying to minimize entropy?
No, not on this data.
In your wider theory?
Yes, absolutely. So the goal-directed agent will minimize its behavioral entropy. Okay? So this will be a quantification of goal-directed behavior. And on top of that, this will immediately imply that its sensory entropy or its sensor sampling entropy will be reduced. And as a result, it will be more exposed to this effect of behavioral feedback. So you will see the perceptual system of a habit learning system will be more tuned, more specialized, if you want, by virtue of having habits, as that of a system that has no habits. Yes, so I would agree with that.
But you would say that that's just one characteristic of a goal-directed system?
Absolutely, it's just a signature. It would be a way to assess whether it's goal-directed or not. What we haven't done, or it would be interesting though, we haven't dealt with that. But you can say, okay, is there a way to also actively pursue the minimization of your behavioral entropy? Right? If you make that your criteria for goal-oriented learning, we haven't touched that. Would be a good idea though.
Okay, but then that might give you a general principle, along the lines of free energy, whatever, to say this is what brains do.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, another, if you like, reductionist or sort of limitative is language for re-explaining goal-directed behavior.
Yeah, but there's a problem there. Sure, but there's a problem that if you would only go for the minimization of your free energy, like the reduction of the variability, like you minimize surprise, you are sacrificing exploration. I don't think you really want to do that. Right? So you are sacrificing your ability to discover novelty. So this is I would argue more that you need a balance between these two.
So it's a signature, but it's not a requirement.
No, it would not be the whole story. Exactly.
Can I just ask, what base is it on to be part of? Is it base 2 or base 10?
This is based, let me see, do we have the equation here? Good question. 2. Yeah. And there's another question in the back there.
Yeah. I could shout. you're now talking about this contextual in terms of habit, and you're now, in your answer to the questions, talking about it in terms of goals.
Yeah.
But earlier, you had separated goal and habit. Is this a goal-oriented system in the sense that, you know, the model-based, or like we would call goal-directed information, or Baleen would call goal-directed, or you did with agency, or is this a habit-based system that this contextual layer is adding?
Okay, good point. So, in this case, for the fully trained system, this is a habit-driven system. Habits acquired by virtue of having the ability to do goal-based acquisition. Does that satisfy you?
No, because
Okay.
I'm trying to figure, so is there a planning step happening within this that's getting translated into a habit?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely. But I will explain that in the next stage. I just want to give a bit now a phenomenological flavor of, let's say, function, and then I'm going to unpack it.
Great.
Yeah? Richard.
Well, you said that the reduction of sensory entropy is one of the reasons for having goal-oriented behavior. But then, well, there's this black room paradox that if you just go for the minimization of the entropy, the perfect state would be simply no sensory information. So then you say that there's another goal which points the organism towards exploration. But then it seems that in this theory where you try to explain what are goals, you simply introduce two more goals, exploration and reduction of entropy.
Maybe it wasn't clear, because the point is, this here, the sampling entropy is only used to characterize the input states of this agent. It's not driving anything that has to do with its problem solving or learning. It's just a quantification of the inputs it encounters, nothing more. Okay? So it has nothing to do with notions of optimizing free energy or not. Okay, so all I'm saying is it does, if you want, the obvious in this case, which is if you have habits, you just sample a subset of your task space. If you sample a subset of your task space, you would expect that the variability of sensor states will be more reduced as compared to a system that explores more of a task space. That's the only statement it's making. Huh?
I don't know if you're aware of the work of some Roderick Little in the United States, who's applying information theory to linear control systems in terms of robotics. I only just recently started reading one of his papers. It seems to be kind of in this area.
Sure, yeah. No, actually, it's very much also to work that Randy Beer was presenting last week, right?
Yeah.
I'm just trying to, you know, I'm not, in this talk I will not pursue this further. I'm just using it to characterize the behavioral properties of the system. If you have an idea what we're looking at when we start to talk about the details of implementation. That's how it's used here. But yes, there's a whole field where people are advanced. Also, Randy Beer, I think, gave an excellent talk on this last week, where people are developing pretty advanced information theoretic measures to understand behavior. And actually, Sergis Asiwala, who will speak after me, will deal with information theoretic measures and complexity measures as they're used understanding brain connectomics. Okay?
I don't know if there's a point of reading on the same topic. I just feel kind of stuck on it because sometimes the sensory variability is a behavior that the organisms find beneficial for its survival, and habits that increase the...
Absolutely. No, look, there are really interesting implications of this, but none of these you have to pursue. You can do it during the summer school. Like, for instance, you can say, well, maybe these are also internal indices you can maintain that tell you something about, let's say, the variability of your input states and whether you want to increase those or decrease those. What we have exploited, I will talk about this later, we are using, let's say, derived measures of this that tell the perceptual system something about the novelty of input states. Okay, but yeah, there's a whole domain of exploration there that has nothing to, this is just a very superficial characterization of the variability of input states. That's it, that's where it stops. Okay?
So just to finish on that, you don't have to explicitly be minimizing entropy or free energy for there to be a brain theory which says that's what the brain is doing. You know, so and you could probably, you say, well, that's not all it's doing, but if you say that that's one of the functions that you're optimizing, and you say there's another one or two generate the system, but I do so by optimizing on these functions in some way, and this generates this architecture. So,
is that a question?
it's a comment that if I want to eliminate goals from my theory of mind, from my psychological language, I could do so in that way, surely.
I don't think so. I don't think you're going to succeed, because you still have to find, let's say, internal structure. Right? If you just say, look, I minimize variability, you can stick your head in the ground, and that's it.
So you need something else.
It's done, right?
But,
so you need more internal structuring of your behavior than just like free energy minimization. I think it's a very interesting concept, and I think it might work well if you talk about perceptual systems, but it's not the whole story of behavior. I think for that you do need something like internal representation of endpoints of behavior that you might want to call goals, that are really structuring your interactions with the environment, and that are structuring how you want to minimize your free energy. That's how you want to call it. And I don't think the free energy concept informs you on how these goals can play that role.
I'm agreeing with that, but I'm saying that that's maybe one of the things that I'm trying to make my system optimal for, but maybe there's some other things. And there could be a small group of things.
I have no problems with this.
Okay.
They can coexist. It's not contradictory in any way. And actually, with Carl Friston, we have quite some discussions about looking at the theory that I'm describing here as, if you want, an implementation of also his free energy concept. And it's in that sense fully consistent. Okay, so what I want to do now, after having given you the top level view, and we still have plenty of time, is, okay, how do we then give some credence to this functional decomposition with respect to the brain? So I want to look at three systems. I want to look at how do we regulate then these stereotype behaviors. And maybe, Tony, how are we doing time-wise? Not very well, right? Okay. Okay, good. Okay, so we're going to keep that one short then. Then I want to talk about hippocampus and how we are dealing with this world state space, how we built a world state space, as I predicted was necessary. And then I'm going to look here at prefrontal cortex, or dorsal premotor cortex more, to try to get a handle on how this goal-oriented decision-making might be implemented in the cortex. So these are sort of highlights I want to make now. Then this one I will just keep short to give you the flavor, and then we can discuss it offline. But basically what I want to drive at here is, like, if this animal is explored in open field, right, you will see that it has to balance a number of behaviors. It might show tickletaxis, it runs along the walls, interpret as a defensive also response, you're less visible to predators. It might find a home base, which it will veer out. It might explore the center of this space. So you have a number of behavioral subsystems that are being expressed, and it must be regulated. So the model we've been advancing on this, and also the model that you saw driving the robot, a part of the robot that you saw earlier, is what we call allostatic control. And basically the notion here is, so look, I have an exploration system and I have a security system. And people here in the room like Marty Sanchez, Vicky Beruzzi, others have been working on this, so you're going to talk with them about it. But the basic idea is that every behavioral subsystem is conceptualized as being homeostatic. It basically means, look, my exploration system has a preferred state. Well, let's say if I want high security, I want to minimize exploration. If I need to go out to find food, I want to drive up exploration to find it. So that means there's a desired state, and then there's a state that I actually measure in the world. Right? So I can look at this difference, and that then informs an action selection system what I have to do. And then I can do this also for security. If I want to go home, I have, let's say I have a current state in the world that informs me about, okay, how far am I from my home base, and I have a desired state if I want to go home. And this difference would inform my behavior. That's in itself homeostatic locally, but the point is you have to continuously balance and regulate each of these behavior subsystems. Right? And that's where the notion of allostatic control comes in. It's a concept that comes very much from physiology, of how do multiple organ systems, how do they get balanced, how do they get regulated. And it basically means that every behavior system has to be tuned to the context. Like if I want to go home and security should be high, then I might want to change the gain in my exploration system. So the tendency of exploration in the way would get minimized. So allostatic control is like a next level of control that is setting the local properties of my homeostatic behavior systems in order to create a robust behavior. So okay, this is the homeostasis. We have Hull, Kurt Lewin, who has advanced this idea of behavior as being occurring in force fields. So there's lots of links into some historical considerations. Let's just look what such a system then does. Here's the experiment that Marty has done, where we look at exploiting such a system for the exploration of a T-maze. So here we visualize the different gradients, the exploration gradient. The robot is not looking actually at these colors, but it's just for our convenience that it is being projected here on the table. Here we have the different Q gradients. So in this task, this is a replication of a task that Cyril Penhart has been performing on rats. There's a Q light, and the Q light informs the rat where it will find a reward. The Q lights are here in blue. Subsequently, once it's in these arms of this Y maze, the rewards will in themselves be emitting their own attractors, their own gradients that will help the rat to get there. This can be smell, for instance. So here you see how the overall behavior results from the accumulation or the superposition of these three different attractive forces emitted by the exploration gradient, the Q gradient, and the reward gradient. Okay? So we see in this implementation that we really implement this allostatic controller in a way that behavior is playing out in, if you want, a force field. Okay, but then we also have from that derived emotion states. It basically means we have this is a test on our iCup robot. This is what Vicky has done. And so here we have our basic behavior systems. Here we have basic emotional states. And the hypothesis we have advanced here is basically that emotional states are defined by the dynamics of these different behavior systems and their ability to resolve problems. So, here we see Vicky with a robot with a touching experiment. Okay. So what we're advancing here, that was also already in the robot you saw earlier, is a tight coupling between the need and drive systems and the emotion or valence systems. They're not decoupled, they're tightly coupled. This is the hypothesis we express here. So that would basically mean that we see that the prediction, and also what we have to further elaborate, is that systems that, for instance, monitor states of self and that control stereotype behaviors, as the maternity behavior that we saw last week, right, would regulate a behavioral subsystem, but in turn also through interfaces, for instance, the ventral area, which would express dopamine and reward signals, or interfaces to the amygdala, which might express valence, is linked to an internal monitoring of how well you actually perform in realizing these behavioral objectives. Yes, please.
So one thing that seems to be missing from your self-state space is the posterior parietal cortex, where you're bringing together an internal representation of your body, the state of your muscles and joints, where they are at any one time, combining that with shoulder-centered coordinates, retinal coordinates, to say this is the self, this is where I am, this is where my body ends and this begins. And any behavior is going to be based on that internal coordinate system. So if I'm going to reach for something, it depends on where my body is at that time. There's also a knowledge of what you're capable of performing, given your energy levels, given your own abilities. And that's a huge portion of the brain that's involved in that in non-human primates. And it's sort of missing from your model. I think it's a really important component.
I agree with you.
Behavior.
Yeah, but what I'm saying, this you could see as a behavioral prefrontal cortex, okay? So think about it in those terms. I'm not saying that's the whole story, but this is like your behavioral core, right? And then memory intense processing will work on that and further improve it.
Right. I got that, but if you're really interested in this bigger picture of things, I think that's a big part of the big picture of, what defines being myself, my state.
Absolutely, no, but you're completely right.
And making inferences about other individual states.
So I completely agree with you. And remember that in the theory I proposed, I talk about this self column, right? That would basically go across the whole axis, including cortical areas. Actually, later I want to point to insular cortex play an important role here. But if I now unpack that and say, let's forget these upper layers. Just think about, let's say, a brainstem regulation of self and associated behaviors, and this is what I'm pointing to. Okay, so it's not an exclusive statement. Right? Yeah. Okay. So is there credence for that way of thinking? Yes, people like Björn Merker, Swanson, or Jacques Panksepp have proposed, I think, pretty coherent, more anatomically grounded models of how this kind of behavior regulation could be implemented by specific structures where they point to brainstem structures like we saw earlier, hypothalamus, periaqueduct brain being an important behavioral regulator, and also amygdala. But we're not going to expand on that now. So what I want to do is look at hippocampus in a bit more detail to show you how we try to now test these ideas on goal-oriented behavior. This is work done together with John Nisman, who will be speaking here tomorrow, and Cesar Reda Costa, who's hiding in the room somewhere. Oh, look at that. So if you want, I gave you this story about an allostatic controller regulating stereotype behaviors. This is a behavioral core that allows you to interact with the world in a fairly primitive but robust way. Now I want to bootstrap that. I want to move towards a goal-oriented interaction with the world that will be more memory dependent, because you want to have a broader time horizon in which you can operate.
So this whole sense of the energetics, entropy, energy landscape, if you will, that for sure is unique to different organisms, because you can have one for an amoeba, you can have one for an unknown primate. So is it true, or would you say that really organizes that landscape for any given organism?
Completely, yes.
And then other things just sort of can change that landscape and work within parameters.
Exactly right. That's exactly the idea. Yeah, so this will be like a behavioral core that sort of keeps you going.
Physics, that has to obey.
Exactly, if you want, yes. So also from a comparative perspective, I think it will be interesting to target it to those terms. Right? So you look at what is a behavioral core, what are the invariant features, and what are the specializations that you might find in them. But here I think you would also find high conservation of neural design principles. So the next step is, if I want to go towards my goal-oriented behavior, I must represent the world. Remember, I meant the big point about developing your state space. So how do you do that? So this state space will be strongly dependent on what, where, and how. Like, what is relevant for my needs? I want coffee. Where do I find it, and how do I get it? And so here you see an example of a robot performing such a task, such a foraging task. So Andre Lubizotto here shows the robot a cue. This is just a test set. Okay, the robot has to place preference on these cues. It has explored this environment. Here's its home base. It sees the cue. It uses local cues like path integration and the vision to then find these preferred places. So there are no markers. So in that sense, it's only relying on the information that has access to itself. So it implements place preference. So how can you think about that from this perspective of goal and behavior? Well, what we showed already, so these entropy analysis I showed you earlier, and further analysis showed that fundamental to this kind of decision making and optimal planning and goal-oriented acquisition of these plans is that you want to work on sensory motor contingencies. That means your primitive representational building blocks, if you want, for your planet are integrated sensory motor states. Okay, so sensory-motor couplets, or segments, as we call it. Now, this is not this a priori. You might think, well, maybe I could just plan on a disjoint representation of sensory states and actions, and I can sort of build some list of how they're related. But what we found in our modeling work, of if you want to think about optimal decision making also in the context of your memory and your goals, you need to operate on these integrated sensory motor states. So is the brain doing this? Okay? Is the brain really building these kinds of conjunctive representations? So now to jump ahead, I did the order wrong. So John Listman, who'll be here tomorrow, I was talking with John about this, and he had this great insight where he realized that if you look at the hippocampus, it's like this little banana here in the rodent brain, as we all know, strongly involved in spatial cognition and the other things. There are actually distinct input pathways onto the hippocampus. From the entorhinal cortex that projects into the hippocampus, you can distinguish a lateral and a medial pathway. And this lateral and medial pathway actually, if you measure the response properties of these cells in the lateral entorhinal cortex, they are very distinct. You will find lateral cells showing more responses to properties of the environment with less spatial specificity. So they would say, well, there's a projector somewhere. While in the medial entorhinal cortex, you will find these so-called grid cells that are highly specific to location. Even though they might have they will have multiple response fields in the environment. So that's sort of illustrated here. So this is the entorhinal cortex. Here we're projecting into the hippocampus, dentate gyrus, CA3, CA1 via the subiculum will go out again to the entorhinal cortex. This is the kind of response field you might see of these medial entorhinal cells. Grid cells, this is space, X and Y. These are then indicating where such a neuron might respond. So these neurons are very specific to locations. And here you see a neuron in the lateral entorhinal cortex, which is much more broader response fields with less spatial specificity and reflecting more sensory properties of the environment. And what John highlighted in what John realized is actually this is the sensory and a motor component that might lead to the kind of integrated sensory motor representation that DEC predicts we need for our decision making. Of course, you can say, well, this is space, this is not action, but these neurons are driven best when the animal moves. So that means the dynamics of these cells gives you something like a heading direction. It tells you something about your actions. So then with Caesar, we basically tested this hypothesis both for the dentate gyrus and for CA3. So we can look at this one first. We already done quite some modeling work on the preceding layers in cortex for the perceptual processing that might feed into the lateral entorhinal cortex, that would define the grid cells of the medial entorhinal cortex. A lot of machinery for that was in place. And the question now became, okay, do we get these integrated sensory motor states in the dentate gyrus? And as our benchmark, we took a classic experiment of Lloyd Gap from the lab of Moser, where they looked at what's called rate remapping. So basically you take an animal, you put it in an environment that's rectangular, you measure the responses in the hippocampus, the dentate gyrus, and also they measure the CA3, so the next stage in hippocampal processing. And here you see where these neurons respond. So here we have a dentate gyrus cell responding at different locations. But then you take the animal out of the rectangular box, you slightly change the environment, you make it a bit less rectangular, you put the animal back in and you measure again. And then they quantified this change in the response as you morph the environment with a population vector, which is basically telling you how does the whole population of neurons respond in a certain environment. Okay, so that you can now calculate the correlation of this population response between different environments. And what they showed is that dentate gyrus shows as much as CA3 a smooth degradation of its response. Now, this was surprising in some sense because up till those experiments were performed, the dominant view on hippocampus was predicting that the main response would be dominated by location. Okay? But if we morph this environment, the animal is still visiting the same positions x, y in space with a slight variation. The main thing that's changing are the visual cues. Like I'm in this room, I'm walking around in this room, we slowly make the walls more circular, right? The positions I'm visiting are largely the same. What is changing are my visual cues. Right? So in our discussion with John, we saw, okay, this might be the benchmark for us, and then show that this degradation is largely due to this sensory contribution. So Cesar modeled this. We built a detailed model, taking into account the known anatomy, like the convergence rates of these projections from lateral medial entorhinal cortex to the dentate gyrus. Cesar spent a lot of time, he can tell you in detail later, on recreating the response properties of the neurons in these different areas. And then we used a competitive response rule that reflects what's called a theta-gamma cycle in the hippocampus or the dentate gyrus. And basically, what is this response rule? So this is the rule that drives the activity in the map. These neurons all display something that's called gamma, right? And gamma and a theta cycle of their responses. So there's sort of a fast response, the spikes, riding within a slow wave of activity. And the idea is that this slower wave of activity is also due to a local excitatory inhibitory coupling, which is recurrent. It means neurons get driven by the input, they spike, they drive a local inhibitory circuit that inhibits the rest of the population. So that's why you get sort of bursts of activity in a very cyclic fashion. And John summarized that in this E% max activation rule that basically says only a certain fraction of the neurons with the strongest input will spike. So it already gives you a winner-take-all response in that network. So what we then did, so here, Cesar plotted the correlation, the population correlation over morphing. So we replicated the load gap experiment with a virtual animal running through this environment. And this is the mixing ratio. This is the ratio of lateral entorhinal cortex projections versus medial entorhinal cortex projections. And what this shows is that at a mixing factor of 0.3, so 30% of your projections carry sensory information and 70% carries action information, you can replicate exactly the morphing curve that Lloyd Gap has presented. So this then gives both credence to the idea that the hippocampus is building these sensory motor integrated representations, and it also makes a testable prediction, because look, if you start to count synapses now, this is the fraction that you will find that come from lateral entorhinal cortex. And then, even though we won't have time for that, okay, then Edward Moser picked up on this idea talking with John, and he then did an experiment where he actually lesioned. So he did the morphing experiment, but now he lesioned lateral entorhinal cortex. If you lesion lateral entorhinal cortex, the prediction would be that this morphing effect would be diminished. And that's also what they find here, right? You see it with lateral entorhinal cortex lesions, you see that this degradation of the population response, you see it reflected here, reflected here, is less. Okay? So in this case, you see with the lesion of lateral entorhinal cortex, that the degradation of the population response for morphed environments are less strong as in the original case as we had predicted with our model. So this really gives credence to the idea that the hippocampus is operating on integrated sensory motor states. We then also expanded this to the CA3, which we just published this year. And there, I will not go into the details of that, but there the point is that you see that this degradation of the response for CA3 is less expressed early on in the morphing experiment, as if CA3 maintains, if you want, more of a memory of this initial environment. And that's also what we showed in this paper, building a very detailed spiking model of the CA3 region operating on these integrated sensory motor states. So let's jump through this now because we want to go to this bit. So now what I've shown you here, that this whole idea of building a memory system around integrated sensory motor states is not unreasonable. It seems something that the hippocampus is actually doing. So now I want to give you a flavor of how this comes together in decision making. And that's work that Encarni Marcos has been doing, and Encarni might be sitting somewhere as well. Building also early work by Armin Doof. But let's just look at the test of a very specific hypothesis. I will jump through this quickly. Okay. The standard notion of decision making in prefrontal areas, so goal-oriented decision making, is something that's called drift diffusion models. And it's reflected here, right? So let's say I have two hypotheses I must choose between. And I'm exposed to perceptual events, stimuli that tell me one or the other. And the idea of decision making is I'm just integrating this information. I have different integrators, each specialized for a certain source of information, triggering a specific action. And whoever hits threshold first, that's what's going to happen. So I'm just integrating perceptual information to come to my decision. However, the DAC theory that we discussed sees decision making as a bit more complicated process where I have indeed perceptual states, which we call C in this case, but I also have memory. I have performed this task in the past and I made errors or I was successful. I'm not so sure about my strategy or I'm very sure about my strategy. I might want to rely on my habits or not. Then I have different, if you want, endpoints of my actions that are relevant. I have been operating within a certain set of objectives for my behavioral outcomes that might be more or less relevant to what I'm doing now. The world might have changed slightly. And then I have the values. Is this endpoint I'm trying to obtain aversive or repetitive? Okay, so with Incarni, we start to look at this question of how do we integrate information for decision making, looking at the countermanding task, and this in collaboration with Stefano Ferena in Rome, who looks in rhesus monkeys at countermanding. And in countermanding, the task helps you to manipulate this memory component of decision making. That's the whole point. Basically what you do, the animal is trained to make a movement left or right, as in the traditional sense, but at irregular intervals there will be an interrupt signal. The monkey is trained to stop its movement. If it doesn't stop the movement, there's no reward. Okay? That's why it's called countermanding tasks. So now, if you generate these countermanding signals, you can control the error rate. And the error rate is your memory of the task. And the question then becomes, how does memory impact the task? And what we showed, so this has neurons in the premotor cortex, close to motor cortex, so close to the output. And we analyze these neurons looking at what's called the variance of the conditional expectation, expressly. And actually the intuition is very simple. So basically saying, look, my neurons in prefrontal cortex are happily firing away given some intrinsic circuit properties. They have some mean rate that is not specific to the task. But this mean rate is modulated by task-specific factors. Perceptual evidence, expectation, memory, and so on. Okay, and then the question became, okay, if I look at this quantification of the neural variability across the trials, how does this now relate to my memory of errors? And to make a long story short, we can jump here. Here I'm comparing about 100 neurons in two memory conditions, right? I performed a go trial previously and have another go trial right now, or I performed a stop trial followed by a go trial. Now the standard interpretation of decision making would say, well, the firing rate of the neuron, which is reflecting the accumulated perceptual evidence, should help me to distinguish between stop or go. But what you see here is that actually after the go signal comes on, so here we look at the two history conditions, the firing rate of these neurons are identical. While what we see is that this intertrial variability is significantly different between the two conditions. In a go-go trial, I have a much lower variability of the response than in a stop-go trial. So dependent on my memory, dependent on, if you want, my errors in the past, my certainty, the neural variability is systematically different.
Where is that variability calculated? Over what sample is the variability calculated?
This is over the whole sample of 100 neurons in a sliding time window of about, I don't know if Incarni is here, only a few dozen milliseconds in the sliding time window. So variability tells you something significant about the role of memory in goal-oriented decision making, while the rate does not. So then, of course, we control this, we show that we can recover the reaction times, and so on, in a reliable way. Then we built a model of this, and this model is basically telling you that I can explain this behavior in the cortex if I consider it a competitive process. So I have a go and a stop, I want to push the button or not. These are competing via inhibitory pools. Each of these neurons will get their perceptual evidence that tell, look, the grating moves left or right. But there's a monitoring system. And this monitoring system is my history. How well did I do? How well did I do? It's autobiographical. And this monitoring system is directly controlling the competition between these two systems. That means if I make few errors, I'm very certain. My monitoring system tells me you're doing really well, so you crank up the competition. If you crank up the competition, you very rapidly switch into one state or the other, in terms of an attractor dynamics that also Murray was talking about. However, if I'm less certain of my actions, my monitoring system will reduce the competition. It will take me longer to converge. And that also explains why, if you have low certainty, there's higher variability, there's less competition in the system. If I have high certainty, I minimize the competition, so I also minimize the variability. So, to now get then to linking this to the idea of habits and goals, and now we are at the level of what are we investigating now, given that insight, is that, okay, if this switch into goal-oriented behavior in a devaluation task can be observed during extinction, the hypothesis is that this has a lot to do with this monitoring system. It's this monitoring system that is regulating the competition in the system. As if here you would have, let's say, a habit-driven system with high certainty. It doesn't consider any more evidence. It very rapidly switches. In this case, you start to change the competition between your action options in prefrontal cortex, this case premotor area, to allow again more behavioral options to be considered, given the goal of the system. Is that reasonable? Well, if you look at the same task here with lesions to the insular cortex, you see strong disruption of this devaluation task. And so that, in my opinion, and this is what we're trying to investigate now, insular cortex is an example of this monitoring system because it tells you something about the self states. How well did I do in achieving my goals? Okay, dependent on my success, I regulate how rapidly I'll make my decisions. Is that an unreasonable idea? Well, not really. If you look at, there's the pain network, so these are all the different areas in the human brain that are correlated with the perception and processing of pain. You see that the insula takes a very central regulatory role. I think you also mentioned insula earlier, or no? Well, I mentioned to you. You see, it has a very central regulatory role to play in integrating across self states coming from brainstem, sensory states from cortex, and the decision-making areas in prefrontal cortex. Right? So, in my opinion, the insula as this monitoring system is also helping you to switch between expression of habits or, again, the fine-tuning of your responses in using more an explicit representation of goals. So these are hypotheses that we will be testing right now. So, what does this mean? A number of things. So first, methodologically, I just was trying to make the point that if we want to study the brain, which is multi-level organization, how should we build theories of this? And I think there we want to, what I was trying to illustrate to you concretely is what we're doing is what you can call convergent validation. Right? So we have abstract high-level theories that functional, that give you a functional decomposition of complex behavior that you can test on your robots. These in themselves are not right or wrong, but they do work in real time on your robot. So they have, in that sense, some plausibility with respect to the behavior. But from there, you extract very specific predictions. And say, okay, I now predict that the brain needs to operate on integrated sensory motor states. And with that, you can then go to your hippocampus and just test that specific prediction. And I see these two lines of models co-evolving in a form of convergent validation, which I think is an important methodological point where there's an immediate role for robots to actually give you behavior, an important anchor point of our theories. And then last, to escape from the billiard ball view on behavior and go to its full complexity, I was trying to naturalize goals and try to come up with also a neural account of how can we think about goal-oriented behavior. Is that story finished? No, by no means. These are initial steps, but I think, also look at these hypotheses now, the insula cortex as a monitoring system that helps you regulate goal-oriented behavior. It's at least a testable hypothesis now. Also try to show that needs, values, and goals are closely tied, that there's not something like a single goal nucleus in the brain that says, oh, let's just optimize reward and then we're going to be happy. Right? There's a much more integrated system across this whole self column. Goals are end states of behavioral sequences. That means goals are not necessarily only rewards. Goals can be anything. So we have to think about these behavior systems declaring almost arbitrary endpoints with associated balance and so on. How is that done? That's rather unknown at this stage, but I believe that this closed loop system we put our finger on now, including the monitoring, might be a step in that direction. And then here, this is all the people I got to thank for this work. You see, we take workplace security very serious. But if, only Giovanni took the wrong bus that day. But if you got any questions, I'm here. Thank you.
Time for a few questions before we split for coffee. So let me kick off. So you end up with something which actually sounds a lot like MAR, that you want a functional, what we call it, computational level description of what's happening, but then there's going to be an algorithmic stroke implementation level theory of it, how it operates in the brain. I mean, is that fair, or is this going well beyond that?
Well, I think David Marr is just very much in this more computational view on understanding brains, right? So that means it's more devoid of behavior, for instance, and also it's trying to compress a function into very specific ideas on what computation would mean and how you implement that. So in that sense, I would not, I think, follow the same approach. However, overall, it's intuition where you would say, look, I have a functional decomposition that I can map through multiple stages onto implementation. Yes, I think this is completely reasonable, but I would argue you already see that Tolman in the SOBAG is doing actually the same thing. But I would be then favoring more the Tolman intuition than the Marr intuition.
I guess Marr maybe emphasized the computational level over the others.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, well, the place to start is with computation.
Right.
And we'll solve those later. And I guess that was also common at the time. Chomsky similarly was doing.
Well, there's another thing about Marr, right? That he would, of course, still be in this whole domain, or in that period of time, there was also this belief of multi-instantiation, right? Where you say, look, I have computation, I have an algorithm, and then you can instantiate that algorithm in many possible pieces of hardware. So the hardware itself doesn't inform you on algorithm. And I think that's a mistake. I think we cannot, don't want to go that far.
So your methodology is top down from the function, but also bottom up through the biology.
Yeah, absolutely.
I have a slightly philosophical question, which may be a bit too long-winded to go into, but I'll just talk briefly about it. In one of your early slides, you were showing this history of psychology,
Yeah, right.
showing a loop around through where the,
Yeah.
and that goes back to the kind of middle of the 19th century.
Mm-hmm.
If you go back earlier in Western science, anyway, back to maybe the 15th, 14th century, there's a history of people. It's always the latest sexy kind of paradigm that gets applied to consciousness and electric consciousness. It used to be. They used to think it was the cables and levers and wires that ran the nervous system, and it was humours, then it was gases, then it was electricity. Every time there was a new technology came along, they said, this is the answer to human consciousness. Now, in the 20th century, it was a computational paradigm. That was the latest sexy technology. Now, it's been shown, really, that all the paradigms have been shown to be actually incorrect. Now, we are all working, probably all of us are working within the computational paradigm at the moment. It's quite possible that that is not any closer to reality than the previous one. It just seems to be how it is because we're all within it. It's probably worth keeping that in mind.
No, look, I agree with you, but we have one big advantage. That at least, we are working with that in mind. We do know this pattern is there. And I think many of the approaches preceding us have also willingly ignored that fact. And I believe we should switch from computation to think more about control. So this is a transition that we're really advocating. But you're right, absolutely.
Are you aware of the work of one of your compatriots, Pim van Lommel, who is a medical doctor in Holland?
No.
Okay. I won't go into great detail, but he was very interested in this concept in the 1970s. He's a cardiac surgeon, and he was surprised by the amount of people. Obviously, when you have a heart attack, you have about 10 minutes to get the person back to life again before there's permanent damage to the brain and they're dead. And he was quite surprised by the number of people who reported to him that they were conscious and could remember and were cognating and whatever during this time when they were brain dead. There was no EEG, there was no brain activity at all, and yet they could remember, they could conceive, and they could describe things that happened in the operating theatre. So he carried out a prospective study over a number of hospitals over 10 years. He went back and talked to people. And he found that 20% of people were able to do this, and there was no EEG, and there was no spike in neural activity at all during this. So if you take Karl Popper's view, but you can never prove a theory, you can only disprove a theory by finding a counterexample, that would be quite a strong counterexample to saying that cognition and perception is a result of spiking neural activity in the brain. He goes on to give some other perspectives which are a bit controversial, maybe not all exactly spot on.
Well, look, maybe it's all glia, we don't know.
Yeah.
But maybe it's only glia cells, right? We don't know.
It's quite easy for people to fall into a common paradigm.
No, but the point, this sounds like something that's good for the coffee break, or maybe even
exactly. That's
for
why
a beer break might sound more appropriate. But don't forget, I agree with you. We should let's say humble in our interpretations. There are many things we don't know, the unknown unknowns and so on. However, we can advance along testable predictions.
Yes.
As long as we do that, we're fine. Okay. In that sense, we can advance along a fairly rigorous program. I have no concerns with that. But the rest we discuss in the coffee break.
Yes, absolutely. That's why I didn't bring it up.
Tony, you got to run to the other corner.
I can shout. I
want
want
to record the questions, you see.
Oh, okay.
So,
But that's okay.
is there two microphones?
Yeah, there are two microphones. One is in front. Okay, Tony's a slow walker.
So this is a more concrete question, and it relates to your measure of performance, whether it's the habit or the learning part. And you brought up this interesting idea that variance gives you more information as to what's going on in terms of how much connectivity or when you add or take away higher order parts. And is that true? I mean, and does it give you some sense of, like you're saying, the landscape, the overall constraints that are driving that system when you measure the variance of any given performance? Yeah. And because in physics, variance gives you much better information than the mean for describing how much, how efficient something is.
Yeah. But so the intuition would be to look, think about all possible actions we can perform. It's quite a repertoire. Yeah? So basically, what every time when you're making decisions, you allow these options to coexist for a longer or shorter amount of time, dependent on how certain you are. Right? So if I'm not so certain, okay, I leave my options open, so the convergence of decisions will take longer, so I retain the information longer, that if something new comes in over my sensors, I can actually jump out of one trajectory and jump into another. So exactly. So this is with intuition, which is very also consistent with all these ideas about attractor dynamics that Murray Shannon was talking about last week. But this is exactly the idea.
So if you had an equation, if you had an equation in a robot, and it was sort of interpreting how the human is behaving, and it had to then give another, obstacle or suggestion, maybe that a variance function would be really useful.
Absolutely, no, I completely buy that. Absolutely, this is exactly what we're after. You're right.
So I want to ask about the implementation issue that was brought up in the earlier question. How concerned are you with the robotic instantiation paradigm, with the physical limitations of robots that are, in fact, I mean, they're so much better now than when I was doing this 20 years ago, starting to look at the robots. They're so much better now, but they're still tremendously limited compared to what animals can do. Mm-hmm. Are you concerned that that's going to limit your, what you can actually see in terms of modeling the animal behavior?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, the robot is a tool we can use. We have to be very clear about its limitations, right? There are plenty of them. However, if you have to say, okay, you can say, no, let's just simulate it. Or you can say, oh, let's just abstract it to something I can do in MATLAB. Then I think you're sacrificing also a lot. So we have to strike this balance. For instance, a lot of the navigation work here that I was describing with, let's say, Hippocampus, we're also pursuing that now in the school. We do it with mobile robots because at least it gives you a very direct contact with the real world. So you really directly know about noise, real time, uncertainties, that you could gloss over just too quickly doing the simulation. But you're absolutely right. We should not overstate the precision or usability of these robot systems. And also actually, we should think about, often now we are forced to use, let's say, standard platforms that are available. Maybe we should think more about really engineering in a very more purposeful way these experimental tools that we need as robot platforms, more tuned to the task we're interested in. Yeah, so I see the problem completely.
Okay, I think we should stop now for coffee. Probably start again at 12:15. Anna, is that okay? Yes. Okay, so, and Anna has some announcements. So.
Hello everybody, hope you recovered from the happy party on Friday. So today and the whole week there will be no tutorials. So it's just lectures until Wednesday, and then you work on projects. There will be some activities related to road mappings. You're not obliged to come during the day, but if you're interested in the politics of supporting science in Europe.
The idea was that in the morning lectures,
yeah,
they should participate.
Okay.
Okay, and the idea being, we have Wednesday, Thursday, we bring a number of people here of different associated projects in Europe in this domain, and they will basically present their view where we're going with this field based on their own projects. And I think it's good for you guys to be exposed to that, so you get a feeling of what's going on, what do people do in this field, what are their concerns, what are the problems, and so on. And if you just join us for these morning lectures, then starting from today, we hope you're going to dedicate, or we wish you dedicate your afternoons and evenings on your projects only, but then use those morning lectures also to your own advantage. You just understand what's the landscape of this field. Even if you disagree with whatever you're going to hear, you find it tremendously boring, you are then aware this is the field we're in. Okay? So I think for that it's very useful to just be exposed. Yeah?
Depends on the pressure the projects will
They can handle pressure.
Yeah.
They're young and they're strong and they're ambitious.
And
goal-driven. And goal-driven, exactly.
Just to tell you, you can use the tutorial room in case you need computers or you need a place to work. The most important thing this week, though, is that the 11th is a free day. It's a holiday. It's a Catalonian holiday. So there will be no lunch served. So you have Catalonian isn't having a good time, so no lunch served. So you have to organize your own lunch. So organize groups, ask people from specs to take you somewhere. But so lectures are as usual.
It's a holiday for the Catalans, not for the participants of the school.
No. There are a few Catalans, but a very few. And they're commemorating actually the heroes of a very famous war during the Spanish succession. The Catalans were defeated, and they lost their constitution. So. No, I said they commemorate the hero of that period. So it's very different. So Viva Catalunya. Okay? So then have a coffee break if you have questions.
When do we
just
get
let me
back
know.
here? 4 to past?
4 to past, please.